Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about cluster bombs. As part of its ongoing military support to Ukraine, the USA has now announced an additional $800 million military support package, which includes the supply of cluster bombs. Now, the use of cluster bombs is highly controversial because they've been banned by more than 100 countries, including 2/3 of NATO. Cluster bombs were first used by Germany during World War II and have been used in a variety of military campaigns since then, including the Vietnam War. However, the problem with cluster bombs is that they drop a myriad of small bombs called bomblets over a wide area, and it's very common for some of those bombs not to explode, and so they lie dormant in the ground and later can cause civilian casualties once the war is over. So in today's video, I'll have a look at the details of the latest military package that the USA has announced in support of Ukraine. We'll have a look at cluster bombs in more detail. We'll talk about the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which has been signed by over 100 countries. We'll have a look at which countries are in that convention and which countries are not. Clearly, the USA, Russia and Ukraine are not. We'll have a look at which countries and human rights groups are opposed to the use of cluster bombs by Ukraine. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary, so what I think the implications of this supply deal are for the war in Ukraine and for Russia.
The United States is making the controversial move of sending Ukraine cluster munitions for its counter-offensive against occupying Russian forces.
President Biden said today it was a, quote, very difficult decision to include controversial cluster munitions in his new military aid package for Ukraine. There are concerns these weapons, which burst like fireworks, could cause civilian casualties.
Ukraine says it needs the help in a stalled counteroffensive against entrenched Russian troops, backing the White House's argument that the use of the controversial weapons is on Ukraine's watch.
Ukraine's counter-offensive has been underway for a month with heavy fighting in places like Bakhmut, but progress has been slower than hoped. Ukraine is short of ammunition and facing entrenched Russian defensive positions. That's why the pressure has been growing for its Western allies to provide more weapons, including cluster munitions. And today, Washington gave the green light.
Russia has been using cluster munitions since the start of this war to attack Ukraine. In this environment, Ukraine has been requesting cluster munitions in order to defend its own sovereign territory.
White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan defended the decision, announced on Friday.
We recognize that cluster munitions create a risk of civilian harm from unexploded ordnance. This is why we've deferred the decision for as long as we could. But there is also a massive risk of civilian harm if Russian troops and tanks roll over Ukrainian positions and take more Ukrainian territory and subjugate more Ukrainian civilians because Ukraine does not have enough artillery. Ukraine would not be using these munitions in some foreign land. This is their country they're defending.
According to the White House, the country has provided written assurances for the careful use of the weapon to minimize risk to civilians.
Ukraine is committed to post-conflict demining efforts to mitigate any potential harm to civilians, and this will be necessary regardless of whether the United States provides these munitions or not, because of Russia's widespread use of cluster munitions. It doesn't make it an easy decision, and I'm not going to stand up here and say it is easy. It's a difficult decision. It's a decision we deferred. It's a decision that required a real hard look at the potential harm to civilians. And when we put all of that together, there was a unanimous recommendation from the national security team, and President Biden ultimately decided in consultation with allies and partners and in consultation with members of Congress to move forward on it.
It's part of an $800 million security package that brings the total U.S. military aid to Ukraine to more than $40 billion since Russia invaded the country in February 2022.
A cluster munition is a form of air-dropped or ground-launched explosive weapon that releases or ejects smaller submunitions. The most commonly used cluster munition is a cluster bomb that ejects explosive bomblets that are designed to kill personnel and destroy vehicles. Other cluster munitions are designed to destroy runways or electric power transmission lines, disperse chemical or biological weapons, or to scatter landmines. Because cluster bombs release so many small bomblets over a wide area, they pose a risk to civilians both during attacks and afterwards. Unexploded bomblets can kill or maim civilians and/or unintended targets long after a conflict has ended and are costly to locate and remove. The so-called failure rate for the bomblets ranges from 2% to more than 40%. The first significant operational use of cluster bombs was by Germany during World War II and was referred to as the butterfly bomb. The technology was also developed independently by the United States, Russia and Italy. And between the 1970s and the 1990s, cluster bombs became standard air-dropped munitions for many nations in a wide variety of types. A basic cluster bomb consists of a hollow shell that can contain up to 2,000 submunitions or bomblets. The bomblets themselves may be fitted with small parachutes or streamers to slow their descent, which allows the aircraft to escape the blast area in low-altitude attacks. Modern cluster bombs can be multi-purpose weapons containing a combination of anti-armour, anti-personnel and anti-material munitions. Since the 1990s, submunition-based weapons have been designed to deploy smart submunitions using thermal and visual sensors to locate and attack particular targets, usually armoured vehicles. Although smart submunition weapons are much more expensive than standard cluster bombs, fewer smart submunitions are required to defeat dispersed and mobile targets, partly offsetting their cost. And because they are designed to prevent indiscriminate area effects and unexploded ordnance risks, some smart munitions are excluded from coverage by the Convention on Cluster Munitions. During the Vietnam War, the USA used cluster bombs in airstrikes against targets in Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. It's estimated between 1964 and 1973, over 260 million bomblets were released, and 80 million of those failed to explode.
Terrifying, lethal, and highly effective, Ukraine is no stranger to cluster bombs. Both sides have been accused of deploying them since Russia launched its invasion, with devastating effect. It's a weapon that breaks up mid-air as it approaches its target, ejecting a number of smaller explosives or bomblets, scattering indiscriminately across an area that can stretch to the size of several football fields. Most of those explosives detonate, but not all, posing a threat to the civilian population long after the war is ended, especially children. Here in Kharkiv, investigators have built a mountain of Russian munitions and evidence of their use in civilian areas. These are just some of the Russian cluster bombs that have been recovered here in the Kharkiv region, and this is an example of a detonated bomblet, which would have been packed with explosives.
The Convention on Cluster Munitions was born out of a collective determination to address the humanitarian consequences and unacceptable harm to civilians caused by cluster munitions. The initial convention was held in Dublin, Ireland in May 2008, where 107 countries agreed to prohibit all use, stockpiling, production and transfer of cluster munitions. The number of countries signing up to the convention has subsequently increased to 123, and the countries that have banned cluster bombs are shown in purple on this world map. And as you can see from this map, there's a really interesting spread in terms of who's in and who's not in. Some of the largest countries in the world, including China, India, Russia, and the USA, have not signed into the convention, and as it stands right now, there are 74 countries still able to use cluster bombs. If we have a look first at the split for Europe, you can see that the majority of countries have signed up to the convention, and those that have banned cluster bombs include France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom. However, notable exceptions are Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, Poland, Greece, and Finland. If we now have a look at the situation for North and South America, once again you can see that the majority of countries have signed into the convention, including Canada, Chile, Cuba and Mexico. However, the countries that haven't signed up include the USA, Argentina, Brazil and Venezuela. The situation for Africa is similar, with the majority of countries agreeing to ban cluster bombs. However, the notable exceptions are Egypt, Libya and Sudan. And then finally, if we have a look at the situation for Asia Pacific, you can see that it's a minority of countries that have actually signed up to ban cluster bombs, including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Afghanistan and Iraq. However, the countries that have not signed into the convention include China, India, Iran, Israel, and North and South Korea.
Cluster munitions are widely banned around the world. They typically release large numbers of smaller bomblets that can kill indiscriminately over a large area. Those that fail to explode pose a danger for decades after a conflict ends. Rights groups and the United Nations Secretary General questioned Washington's decision on the munitions. Ukraine has asked for the weapon and said the move would have, quote, an extraordinary psycho-emotional impact on Russian forces.
Very disappointed with the news today, and we condemn it in the strongest sense. The transfer of cluster munitions is contrary to international law and will lead to civilian harm.
Providing these cluster munitions has been divisive both within Washington and among allies who've been providing weapons to Ukraine. NATO's Secretary General today had to tread carefully.
Is there not a risk that we could see first cracks in NATO's unity?
When it comes to cluster ammunition, there is a difference between allies, because some allies have signed the convention on cluster munitions and they don't have the cluster munitions. So, of course, there is no cluster munitions to provide to Ukraine.
A variety of both the USA and Ukraine's allies have come out and condemned the use of cluster munitions. Canada was one of the first countries to criticise the supply arrangement, and an official government press release stated, "We do not support the use of cluster munitions and are committed to putting an end to the effects cluster munitions have on civilians, particularly children." Canada is fully compliant with the convention, and we take seriously our obligation under the convention to encourage its universal adoption. Germany and the United Kingdom have come out and stated that they do not support the supply of these sort of weapons. And the Spanish Defence Minister, Margarita Robles, recently told reporters Spain, based on the firm commitment it has with Ukraine, also has a firm commitment that certain weapons and bombs cannot be delivered under any circumstances. No to cluster bombs, and yes to the legitimate defence of Ukraine, which we understand should not be carried out with cluster bombs. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because there's been a lot of press coverage of this deal for the USA to supply cluster bombs to Ukraine. So I wanted to give you a bit more detail in terms of what a cluster bomb actually is and why there is a lot of opposition to the use of these sort of weapons. And as you've seen from today's video, the problem with cluster bombs is that they send a large number of small bombs over a wide area. And unfortunately, some of those bombs do not detonate. When they hit the ground, they dud or just fail to explode. And as a result of that, those explosives can lie dormant in the ground for a long period of time. In some situations, up to 20 or 30 years. So a long time after the conflict has ended and everything goes back to normal, those bombs still have the potential to detonate. And it's for that reason that a lot of countries have banned their use, because there have been a multitude of cases of civilians and children being injured by these unexploded bombs. So you may be sitting there thinking, well, if these bombs are so bad and can cause major problems, why haven't they been outlawed by every country in the world? And the simple answer to that is that some countries have retained the right to use these bombs because other countries are still using them, so they want to fight fire with fire. It's exactly the same argument when we talk about nuclear weapons. In the 1960s and 70s, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament asked for all countries that had nuclear weapons to dismantle them and to never use them again. But obviously there was a risk that if everybody did dismantle all of their weapons and one country retained the use of them, that country could then dominate everybody else. And that's really the crux of the matter with regards to cluster munitions. If one country is using them in warfare, then it potentially gives them an advantage over the opposition, because cluster munitions are very good for attacking tanks and other moving vehicles. Because those targets are moving, it can be difficult to strike them with traditional weapons. However, with cluster munitions, you can drop bombs over a wide area, and therefore you should be able to destroy those tanks. So if one side does have access and the other doesn't, then it doesn't become a fair fight. And that is the USA's position on why it's supplying cluster bombs to Ukraine. Russia has been accused of using cluster bombs from day one in this war, and Ukraine wants to be able to retaliate. Now, as you've seen from today's video, Ukraine has stated that they won't use those bombs on Russian land. They are using them to defend their own territory in an attempt to push Russia back. Now, the use of these weapons will cause problems for Ukraine over the long term, because once this war is over and the land is returned back to its normal use, there will be a huge clear-up operation to try to remove any unexploded devices. But as you saw earlier in the video, the reason that the USA is happy to provide these cluster bombs is that that clean-up operation is going to have to happen anyway, because Russia has been using cluster bombs. So it doesn't really matter whose bombs they are. If you've got an unexploded device that's sitting in a field or a lake or somewhere else on the land, you're going to have to comb the whole area to remove all of those devices. So the logic here from Ukraine's point of view is that we're going to have to do this anyway, so we may as well start using the bombs ourselves to push the Russians back. So I think this explains why the deal has been done. But if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture here, there is a strong message that the USA is sending to Russia. Russia is accused of having used cluster bombs for the last 16 months or so, and the USA has now stepped up and said to Russia, if you're going to use them, we are going to supply them to Ukraine so they can use them in retaliation. So essentially the USA is saying, whatever you do, we will match you, and we will continue providing support to Ukraine until this war is done. The USA has now provided over $40 billion worth of support since the invasion started. And $40 billion is a massive number. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that Russia posted a deficit in 2022 of around $48 billion. And that enormous loss is almost the same as the cash support that the USA has given to Ukraine. Now, as I'm sure you'll be aware, it's reported that when President Putin sent the troops into Ukraine, he expected the conflict to last for around 3 days. We have recently passed the 500th day of this war, so considerably longer than 3 days. And the problem that Russia has is that this war is costing them a fortune, both financially, because they're having to invest into all of the munitions and the personnel to keep fighting the war, but also economically. The sanctions that have been applied against Russia are killing the Russian economy. They have lost thousands of companies that have exited from Russia. They've lost a lot of trade relationships. They've lost a lot of their markets in terms of selling oil and gas and other commodities. And they're having to provide discounts to other countries such as India and China to encourage them to buy more directly from Russia. And therefore, the decision to invade Ukraine could be the costliest decision ever made in the history of mankind. And what Russia is seeing right now is that the USA is standing firmly behind Ukraine and saying, we will continue supporting them, we will give them whatever they need to keep fighting you, we will keep providing military support, we'll provide financial support and other forms of support until Ukraine wins this war. And that must look like an intimidating proposition from President Putin's point of view, because his economy is crumbling, the war effort is faltering, they're being pushed back on all different fronts, and they're now receiving both financial support and also military support that will be very damaging for Russia. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.